Hello, my name is Dr. James Johnson, and I want to thank you for joining us for the next lesson in this series on the spiritual space. And in this series, we are looking at God's original design for creation, specifically in the spiritual space, the unseen world that He created for heavenly beings to occupy, and how they interact and intersect with the physical or the natural world. And as we continue in this series, we're going to continue understanding how we got from that original design to where we are today. And if you haven't watched the earlier episode, I encourage you to go back to watch the first one, as that's going to give you the context and background to understand where we are in the series, and that you'll understand what's going on. So what do you think leads to rebellions in history? I mean, what is it about people that makes us dissatisfied with the status quo of society or whatever organization that we're part of, that makes us want to rebel, that makes us want to push back, to create something different, sometimes with force and violence, to overthrow the existing leadership structure to create something new? Well, when I think of rebellions, the first one that comes to mind for me is the French Revolution. And while there are numerous things that led to the French Revolution, the most significant reason was that the common everyday people were no longer satisfied with being submissive and subservient to the wealthy elite and to being ruled by a monarchy. They saw the rich and the wealthy living lavish lives while they were providing everything for them. They were the serving class while there was a ruling class above them. And if you weren't part of the nobility, if you weren't part of the wealthy elite, there was just no way to break out of your poverty. This restricted their freedom, and so they rebelled in order to create a new society where they could choose their futures and to have a set of leadership that was out to help promote their welfare, not to just live off the wealth that had been accumulated. You see, whenever a person becomes distrustful of leadership, rebellion takes place. They either begin to come with these ideas of doing it for themselves, or they share the ideas and get a group together to rebel. But if you are no longer convinced that the leadership is after your best interest, then there's going to be some kind of rebellion, some kind of pushback, some kind of eventual overthrow of the status quo. And what we're going to see is that there were numerous rebellions throughout history against God that brought us to where we are today. Now let's do a quick review of what we learned in our first lesson. In the last lesson, we recognized that God had an original design for creation. That when God created the heavens and the earth, He created them in such a way that they were meant to connect, they were meant to overlap and intersect with each other. And that we called these intersections cosmic geography, places where heaven literally meets earth. And the ancient peoples, the ancient Mesopotamian cultures, and specifically the ancient Semitic cultures that would create the nation of Israel and the Jewish faith and the Jewish culture, they believed that there was a literal connection between the physical world and the spiritual world, between the natural and the preternatural. And so as we recognize that there are these two spaces, the unseen world and the seen world, the spiritual and the natural, we also recognize that the Bible tells us that God made two families, one for each realm, to be His image bearers, to be His ambassadors, to have delegated authority given to them, that they would rule and reign over their space the way God rules and reigns over everything. And these intersecting points where God's presence brought together His two families are sacred space. That God's space is sacred. And that's where we left off in our last lesson, talking about how God's space is sacred. That no one who is unfit for God's space can be in God's presence without dying. Even Moses, when Moses said, "Lord, show me your glory," God had to put His hand over Moses to shield him from the full force of His glory, because if he would have gone into His presence, God tells Moses, "No one can see my face and live." And yet, even if only catching that small glimpse of God's glory, Moses came down the mountain radiating and he had to put a veil over his face because the people were so scared of the glow that he had from being in a small portion of God's presence. God's space is sacred. And that's where we left off last time. Now, we have to remember that where God established his throne, his presence was meant to be in Eden. That God created the heavens, and we talked about how there were multiple heavens. There's the first heaven, the sky where the clouds are and the birds fly. The second heaven, where the stars and the planets are in the cosmos. And the third heaven, which is where his throne room, where his heavenly family was. But God created a sacred space where these things meet together in Eden. And in our last lesson, we talked about how Eden had a garden in it, an orchard, the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden was on a mountain, because mountains and gardens are where the gods live. And so God set up his home on a mountain, the mountain of God, in the land of Eden, and had a garden on it where Adam and Eve were put by God to take care of the garden and to intersect with him and the heavenly family. The heavenly family and the earthly family were meant to connect there. This was God's original design. But as we mentioned before, when people get upset at the status quo when it comes to leadership, they rebel. And as we look at the scriptures, we will find there are 6 major rebellions. And we're going to answer the question, how did God's original design get corrupted through these rebellions? That as different groups from the heavenly family and the earthly family rebel against God, it changes history forever and will completely upset God's original design for creation. So as we go through each of these 6 rebellions, I want to ask you to do something that maybe you've never done, or at least haven't done in a long time. I want you to do your best to act like you've never read the Bible before. To act like you aren't familiar with the faith, that if you were like me and grew up in church, that you would do your best to disregard some of the traditions and some of the beliefs that we have had poured into us by well-meaning but sometimes misguided or misunderstood religious leaders, or the teachings were misunderstood by religious leaders. Let's start at the beginning, look at what the scriptures say, and see if we can put it together into a cohesive narrative. So at this point in God's design, the heavenly family and the earthly family are meeting together in Eden, in the garden, on the mountain of God, in God's presence. But then a rebellion takes place. The first rebellion of the 6 is Lucifer. Now, most of us are familiar with Lucifer. Sometimes we call him Satan or the devil, and we're going to talk about the different names of Lucifer eventually. But Lucifer is his name, and as we look at Lucifer, most of us have an image that comes to mind. And I want to give you a second to get that image. This is what I see in my mind when I think of Lucifer. Red, horns, hellfire, pitchfork. Where do we get these ideas from? Well, most of these ideas of the image of Lucifer, of what the devil looks like, comes from this idea of the ancient beliefs that the demons were like goats. They had horns and they walked on goat legs like satyrs. And we'll see as we get to the ancient languages that many of the Hebrew and Aramaic words for demon or evil spirit are connected to goats and animals that have horns, and this idea. So this gets connected to Lucifer as a demon, as a evil spirit, as the rebellious, one that institutes the first great rebellion against God. But Lucifer is never actually described that way in the Bible. He's actually described as being beautiful, of being an angel of light. So where do we get this image from? Well, one of the things that began to happen during the early church into the Middle Ages is as people started learning about the Christian faith and they started tracing out the ideas of the afterlife, of this hell that Jesus taught about, this underworld existence where we are separated from God. And they tried to figure out how to describe it. And guys like Dante Alighieri in his book The Inferno began to make demons look like monsters. And it stuck, this idea of scary hell, where we want to scare people into the Christian faith and into the kingdom because you don't want to go to hell when you die, and that Lucifer, the devil, is the king of the underworld. But the Bible tells a little bit of a different story than that. And to understand it, we've got to go back to the scriptures. So if you remember, when we talked about the mountain of God, where Eden was, we went to the book of Ezekiel, and we said that Ezekiel's message from God to the king of Tyre was an allusion to the history of Lucifer. Let's go back to that and let's see what Ezekiel had to say about Lucifer and put that into a little bit better perspective. In Ezekiel 28, talking about Lucifer, he says, "You were in Eden, the garden of God." You see, Lucifer was there. He was with God. What was he doing there? Ezekiel explains in verse 14, "I placed you there with an anointed guardian cherub. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked about amidst fiery stones." That God put Lucifer in his sacred space with the guardian cherubs, and he walked among the fiery stones. Now remember that when we see these images, this is God's sacred space. And while Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel are having apocalyptic visions of God's space, so that means that they're fantastic images that symbolize earthly realities, the reality is that God has throne guardians. However they're symbolized by their descriptions and what they're covered with, all these things with the wings, what matters is God's space is sacred, and seraphim, heavenly beings, Elohim, that have the job of protecting God's space, are with him wherever his presence goes. And Ezekiel sees the image of the four wheels with the Spirit in the wheels, and wherever the wheels turn, it went, and God's presence directed them, and the living beings went with it, and that there was this fire that was in it. This is where Lucifer was created to be, in God's presence. So Lucifer was created to be a throne guardian. Look at what it says in the beginning of Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 1, when Ezekiel sees the image of God's presence, it says, "In the middle of the living beings was something like burning coals of fire, or like torches. It moved back and forth among the living beings. It was bright, and lightning was flashing out of the fire." And so we see that Lucifer was created to be a throne guardian of God. He actually explains, it says, "You were covered in all these precious jewels. You were beautiful. You were the image of perfection." Lucifer was a beautiful throne guardian that spent his creation in the beginning, who knows how long, in God's very presence. Because one of the things we don't know is we don't know exactly how long between the creation of the heavens and the creation of the earth took place. Could have been a moment, could have been eons. We don't know, because this is before time actually really mattered, before time really existed. That Lucifer, as one of the throne guardians of God, one of the guardians of God's sacred space, walking among the stones of fire in God's presence, would have been constantly with God, hearing truth straight from his mouth. And so this was his place. This is where he was made to be. But Ezekiel tells us this: "You were blameless in your behavior from the day you were created until sin was discovered in you." So as we look at Lucifer, we realize he was created in heavenly splendor. All these different precious stones were his covering, that he was created in beauty, the model of perfection, blameless until sin was discovered in him, as one of God's throne guardians protecting God's sacred space. So what was Lucifer's sin? This is an image from John Milton's Paradise Lost, and many people, including Milton, have tried to characterize Lucifer, to give him a backstory, to try to personify him and make him a human being, or like a human being, to have a personality with wants and drives and desires. But the Bible is actually really clear about what Lucifer's sin actually was. If we go over to Isaiah chapter 14, we get more of Lucifer's backstory. Look at Isaiah 14, verse 12. "Look how you have fallen from the sky, O shining one, son of the dawn." Remember, we said in our first lesson that morning star is a name for heavenly beings, and it is attributed here to Lucifer, the morning star, the shining one, son of the dawn. It's also translated morning star. You have been cut down to the ground, O conqueror of nations. Now, why would Lucifer be called a conqueror of nations? Well, once again, just as Ezekiel is receiving a message from God to be given to an earthly king, Isaiah has been given the same thing. But both of them make allusions to how this earthly king has the same desires and the same behaviors as Lucifer did. And they make an allusion, they make a comparison here between those two, that the heavenly being Lucifer, his behavior is being reenacted by an earthly king. And so Lucifer was also a conqueror of nations. We'll talk about that as we get a little bit further in. You said to yourself, I will climb up to the sky. Above the stars of El, I will set up my throne. Now, we learned in our last lesson that El is the root word for God, like Elohim. El, this was the one of the Mesopotamian names for the god who was the father of Baal, and Baal was the Babylonian god that was worshipped. That we eventually changed Baal, B-A-L, gets changed into Baal, B-A-apostrophe-A-L, or as we say in English, Baal. And so Lucifer is saying, I'm going to climb up to the sky. Above the stars of God, I will set up my throne. I will rule on the mountain of assembly on the remote slopes of Zaphon. And so it's this recognition that Lucifer wanted to be in the place of God. He wanted to rule above the stars in the heavens where God was. Remember, the third heaven is above the stars. And of course, if stars are also portrayals for heavenly beings, he's saying, I want to be above even the heavenly beings. I want to be the top dog. I want to be the chief. He says, I will climb up to the top of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. So this is what Lucifer wanted, to replace God, to be like the Most High. That he, somewhere along the way, being in God's presence, led to jealousy, led to selfish desire, and an idea to try to overthrow God and to be like him. But verse 15 tells us, but you were brought down to Sheol, to the remote slopes of the pit. The word Sheol is a Hebrew word that's connected to the underworld. It's also translated the grave. That the ancient peoples believed that because you buried people into the ground, that because of cosmic geography, the underworld was actually under the world. And so we see Lucifer's sin was a desire to be like God, and he rebels. Now, some people say that at this point, Lucifer leads a rebellion in heaven, because the book of Revelation tells us there was a war in heaven. And we're going to talk more about that when we get to that section, but the Bible doesn't say exactly when those angels rebelled. We get some ideas, but we have to read it in context. The Old Testament records nothing of Lucifer leading a heavenly rebellion. There are multiple rebellions. There's 6 we're going to talk about. But at this point, Lucifer is the only one who is rebelling. He wants to take God's place, but he was brought down to Sheol, into the grave, to the remote slopes of the pit. So how did Lucifer go from being one of God's throne guardians to being a sinful heavenly being that is thrown down into Hades, into the grave? Well, because his rebellion coincides with another rebellion, and they're actually intertwined. They intersect together. And that second rebellion is Adam and Eve's rebellion. Adam and Eve, as we famously know, even non-Christians know of Adam and Eve's rebellion. How did that happen? Well, once again, I know I'm hitting this horse that's dead too much, but I got to get our brains around this idea that heaven and earth in God's original design were connected. That when God made the heavens and the earth, his heavenly family, the Elohim that he made, intersected with the sons of men, the human beings, Adam and Eve, in the Garden of Eden, where God's throne was. And so every day that Adam and Eve met with God, Lucifer would have been there. They would have known him. They would have been familiar with him. And one of the other things that we have no clue how long it was between the creation of the heavens and the heavenly family before the earth. We also have no clue how long Adam and Eve lived in Eden with God, because this is before time mattered. They were in God's presence. They were able to eat of the tree of life and continue to live. So this could have, who knows how many years, centuries, eons, we just don't know. We know that after the rebellion, Adam and Eve lived almost 1,000 years, but we have no clue how long they lived in the garden with God and in his presence with the heavenly family. So they were familiar with Lucifer. They would have known him. They would have seen him every day they walked with God. And so when God created his families, we mentioned this idea that God delegated authority to them, that they were supposed to be image bearers. Well, we see this very clearly in Genesis chapter 2. So let's go back to that passage. God makes human beings. He makes Adam and Eve, and he blesses them. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 28, God blesses them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every creature that moves on the ground." You see, God had delegated authority to leaders in the heavenly world and the earthly world. And the Bible shares this with us in a very clear way in examples, even if it doesn't implicitly state it. The reason why it doesn't implicitly state it is there was no need to. It was part of the culture of the day. Kings delegate authority to their family members. But because we don't live in a kingdom here in the United States, we live in a democratic republic where we elect our representatives to be our representatives in the government on our behalf. But in a kingdom, the king has family. The king has a court. And the king delegates authority to family members and members of his royal court to rule and reign over the territory on his behalf. And that's what God did to his heavenly family and his earthly family. He delegated authority to them. And Adam and Eve's authority on God's behalf was to rule over the earth. They were literally supposed to be the rulers of the planet. And so as this goes on, that was God's design. Fill the earth, have children, create families, and govern the planet Earth. You are the rulers of the earth on my behalf. And this goes on for who knows how long, until a talking snake comes along. And once again, this is a narrative that is very familiar. Even non-Christians and non-Jews know the story of the serpent who tempts Eve with the forbidden fruit. But because we have heard this narrative so many times, it's become normal. It's just become part of the script, and we don't question it. But when's the last time you talked to a snake? When's the last time you sat on the ground and a snake slithered up and asked you how your day was and wanted to know how your family was doing and if you thought that the weather was going to be nice over the next couple of days so it could make its plans and if we had any vacation plans? That does not happen. Animals do not speak. And so when we see this part of the narrative, there's a few options we can choose from. Option number one, take the passage wooden literally as we've always read it and say the snake was talking to Eve and tempted Eve. That this is actually a talking snake. Option number two is that the snake wasn't talking, but that Lucifer was able, because as he was a spiritual being, he was able to possess the snake and make the snake talk to Eve. Either way, this does not match up with reality, because in reality, animals don't talk. Yes, I know you're probably thinking about Balaam's donkey who talked to him, but the Bible portrays that very clearly as an abnormal event, that Balaam had that donkey for a long time, and this is the first time it ever spoke to him, and it was an abnormal event. Eve and Adam do not act like this talking snake is weird in the least. So we have another option, and I've heard some people believe this, that once upon a time, human beings were able to speak to animals and talk to them, and that animals and human beings were able to converse with each other and communicate with each other. It's possible, I guess, but I don't find that very plausible because it doesn't match up with reality. Another option, which is what I would suggest, is that maybe we've misunderstood the passage. You see, one of the things that can happen over time is we can try to translate the Bible from the original languages on the knowledge we have at the time. And when the Bible was translated from the Septuagint into Latin and from the Latin Vulgate into English, the idea of the word that was translated from Hebrew into Greek, into Latin, into English, had the connotation of a snake. And this is what we read in Genesis chapter 3. Now the serpent was shrewder than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. And if you're like me and you grew up in church, you just always heard this. But you know that words can have multiple meanings. We have that happen all the time. We can talk about a plane that flies through the air, or we can talk about the plane of, the map that we're talking at, or the graph or the chart, that what plane are we measuring an angle at. Multiple meaning words that spelled the same, or words that have connections but aren't identical to each other. Okay, so for example, to sneak up on someone means to walk quietly. And so one of the names for tennis shoes, because they are so quiet when people walk on them, is sneakers. Because they are quiet, they allow you to sneak around. So the word sneakers is talking about shoes, and a sneaker is a person, but the words are interconnected. This is the same thing in the Hebrew with the word we translate serpent, and it's hanasheth. Nasheth deals with serpent-like things, and the prefix ha is like the. So the snake-like thing. So that could be a serpent, but nasheth can also refer to things that shine, like armor. Armor as referred to as nasheth when it talks about armor shining. Heavenly beings are also referred to with the word nasheth. Hanasheth refers to the heavenly beings, the Elohim that guard God's presence. Other translations of the similar word is the word seraphim. Seraph is connected to the word snake as well. And so this connection between shiny and snake, because armor was made with scale patterns at the time, and the people looked kind of like snakes, and they were shiny, so these words kind of interconnected with each other. The word that we have translated wild animals just means living things. A proposition I want to make to you is that this was not a snake. This was a shining one that had snake-like characteristics. That a snake is slippery, it slithers, it's quiet, it's sneaky. And this is what Lucifer is doing. Lucifer's being sneaky, but he is a shining one. So we could retranslate this with a context to translate it or paraphrase it as this. Now the shining one was shrewder than any of the living beings the Lord God had made. The Bible tells us that Lucifer was wise, that he was created in perfection. He would have been in the very presence of God. He was knowledgeable, perfect in wisdom, the passage says in Ezekiel. And so Lucifer could easily be described as a shining one. Because here's a follow-up question. When the snake talks to Adam and Eve, why do they trust it? This is the big piece of evidence that helped me lean away from the word being translated as serpent and instead being translated as shining one. Not just because the word could, and I wanted it to be that way, because Adam and Eve would have no reason to trust an animal over God. Why in the world, if a snake could talk, if human beings could communicate with animals, if it really was a snake talking to them, why would they believe an animal that was talking to them over the words of God they had received straight from God? But what if it was Lucifer, a shining one, that they had spent who knows how much time around? Every time God's presence was there and they were walking with God in the garden, Lucifer would have been there as one of the throne guardians of God's sacred space. They would have known Lucifer. They would have trusted Lucifer. And this is why, when Lucifer asked the question that we are familiar with, he said to the woman, "Is it really true that God said you must not eat from any tree of the orchard?" Is it really true? They would have trusted him to say, well, I don't know. We thought it was. You see, if it was any other situation, I feel quite certain Adam and Eve had spent enough time with God at this point to know that they could just go and ask him. If the snake came up and said, hey, did God really say that? Is it really true that God said that you must not eat from the tree of the orchard? They'd say, well, snake, that's a good question. I'll wait till God comes back and I'll ask him. But because this was a shining one, because this was Lucifer, they trusted him. They believed he was trustworthy. They had never had any reason to doubt him before. And so it goes on to tell us that they saw that the fruit was beautiful, they desired it, and they ate it. Why would Lucifer want to get Adam and Eve to break their relationship with God? And this is something we don't talk about very often, but we get the answers in the end of the chapter. God shows up. God calls out to Adam and Eve, "Where are you?" And they were hiding. It said, "We were hiding because we were naked and we were afraid." They felt shame because they had broken their relationship with him. God calls out to them not because he doesn't know where they are, because he wants them to know where they are, to admit they are no longer in a healthy relationship with him. And, of course, God says, "Who told you that you were naked?" That's the question. Who told you? Another word, we can say a different way. Who convinced you that you were naked, that you needed to cover up, that you needed to be ashamed of yourselves? And Adam blames Eve. Eve blames Lucifer. And then God pronounces judgment. Now, to Adam, he receives the Adamic covenant, which is not a good thing. It's a promise that from now on, it's going to be hard to get food. Instead of getting everything they need from the orchard and just gathering everything they need from the garden, they're going to have to till the land and farm it. And that Eve will no longer be able to give birth to children without pain. We have no clue what God's original design for childbirth was. The Bible doesn't tell us. But having been with my wife when she's given birth to our 2 daughters, I can tell you it was not a pleasant, comfortable, joyous experience. Now, it was joyous. That's probably not the right word to use. It wasn't a happy experience until the children were born. And once they were born, there was joy. But giving birth is painful. It's not something that is pleasant. And so Eve has been a recipient of a consequence as well. And in the midst of all of this, the serpent, the shining one, gets a punishment. Look at what he says. The Lord God said to the serpent, said to the shining one, or we could say he said to Lucifer, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all the cattle and all the living creatures of the field," that you are cursed above all the other living things. "On your belly you will crawl, and dust you will eat all the days of your life." This is where once again people say, "See, James, he says that you're going to crawl on your belly like snakes do." But do snakes eat the dust? Do snakes eat dirt? Well, they crawl on the ground, so maybe they do. Maybe some dust gets in their mouth. No, snakes don't eat dust. They don't do that. And this also means that you have to twist nature to say that snakes used to not crawl on their bellies. You're making all kinds of we call this eisegesis. Exegesis is where you pull information out of the text. Eisegesis is where you force information into it. We never want to force anything into the text. I believe by looking at the context, the culture this was written in, and what the words actually say, we can understand this in its original purpose, was to say Lucifer was a shining one. Adam and Eve trusted him because he was one of God's throne guardians. He rebels against God, and he receives a punishment of having to be thrown down to the earth, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. Now, remember the connection we made to Isaiah's story that he tells about Lucifer. And he says that you were thrown down from heaven to the ground, and you were thrown into Sheol, into the underworld, into the grave. Well, this is where we start seeing this idea come from. Because the word here for dust or earth is the word eretz. And eretz in Hebrew can be used to refer to planet Earth, farmland, soil, territory, or even a nation. But in the ancient language of the time and in the extra-biblical writings, we also see that the word eretz was a common term for the grave or the underworld. So now we can piece together Isaiah, Ezekiel, and the book of Genesis to see where all of this is, that now everything has changed. Before, heaven and earth connected, but now all these relationships have been fractured. And based off of what the Bible says, the ancient cultures believed that this is how the world would be after the division that was created by the rebellions. That before, heaven and earth connected in Eden, but now the heavens are separated. You see, there's no longer the kingdom of God, that the heavenly realm coming down to earth. There is actually a division. And now we've got the sky where the clouds and the birds are, the space where the planets and the stars are, and then God's heaven, the third heaven, is no longer interconnected the way it was originally meant to be. And now we've got an addition of a new area called Sheol, the underworld, where Satan was cast down to. And that when it says he would eat the dust. The only way to eat dust is to be thrown into the ground, like face first. Imagine somebody, taking a swan dive face first into the ground. And they would eat dirt. And it's this poetic language of the time. And many commentators agree that this is poetic language to say that you have been thrown down like a snake on its belly. You are eating dirt, because now you've been thrown into the ground. You've lost your space in heaven, and now you no longer are in God's presence. Both Adam and Eve, as well as Lucifer, are now no longer fit for God's sacred space, and God's presence locks them out of Eden, and now there's no longer an Eden to go to. And ever since then, man has been trying to get back. One of the things that fascinated me when I studied the tabernacle and the temple was that they were modeled after Eden. That just as there were three spaces, there was the earth, Eden, and the Garden of Eden, right? One on top of the other. In the tabernacle and the temple, there was the courtyard, the holy place, and the most holy place. And God's presence was at the center of each of them. God's presence was in the Garden of Eden and in the most holy place in the tabernacle and the temple. The tabernacle and the temple were decorated with almond blossoms and apricots and fruits and trees and leaves. Like it was meant to look like Eden. That it was supposed to be reconnecting to God's presence the way Adam and Eve had in Eden. And so now that the world has been shifted, the ground has been cursed, Adam will now have to slave over the ground to farm the land. Eve will now have pain and childbirth. Another part of the Adamic covenant was to promise that the wife would want to rule over her husband. And ever since then, women and men have been in contention with each other for what place they are in society, in the home. That the man is now made to be the master, and the woman, the wife, wants to rule over him. There's this contention. And we see this in society all the time, all throughout history, that men have tried to master women and make them property, and women have tried to rule over the men in the home. And so the world has changed. There's also another promise. God tells Lucifer that he is going to put enmity between the woman and the snake, between human beings and Lucifer. There would be enmity, and that one day she would strike and step on Lucifer's head, that Lucifer would bite the heel, and that a future seed, we know that that's the Messiah, will crush Lucifer's head. And so as we look at this, we recognize that even though God's original design has been upset, even from the beginning, God lets us know there is a plan. But there's another consequence. Not just that Adam and Eve have to leave God's presence. Remember, if you remember, the book of Genesis tells us that God puts heavenly beings with fiery swords outside of Eden to keep Adam and Eve from coming back in and eating from the tree of life, because he does not want them to live forever in their sinful state. They can no longer enter into God's sacred space again. They're no longer fit for it. But there's another consequence. You see, Lucifer wanted to trick Adam and Eve not just out of a relationship with God. He wanted to trick them out of their birthright. And scholars disagree on exactly how this happened, but somewhere in this exchange, with God throwing Lucifer down and God not destroying Lucifer, but allowing him to live for another purpose, that Lucifer actually becomes the ruler of the earth. Human beings were supposed to rule and reign over it, but because they sacrificed their birthright to Lucifer, now Lucifer is the king of this world. And that sounds crazy, but look at what the Bible says in Matthew chapter 4, when Jesus is being tempted by Lucifer. At the end of the temptation, what does it say? Again, the devil took him, talking about Jesus, to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their grandeur. And he said to him, I will give you all these things if you throw yourself to the ground and worship me. Isn't this supposed to be a twist? You see, God threw Lucifer to the ground. And now Lucifer wants God in skin, Jesus, to bow on the ground in front of him and worship him. Lucifer used to worship God, and now he wants God to worship him. And in exchange, he will give him all the kingdoms of the world. You see, that's what Jesus wanted, was to get the world back, all the kingdoms of the world. That was his desire, was to restore everything back. And he's saying, I'll give it to you the easy way. No cross, no suffering, no persecution, no torment. Just worship me. But you see, for a temptation to be real, the temptation that's being offered must actually be something you can give to that person. If I'm going to tempt someone, like let's say that I went up to you and I said, hey, I'll give you $1 million if you go steal that pair of shoes from me. Go into that person's house and steal a pair of shoes, I'll give you $1 million. Now, in order for that to be a temptation, I have to have $1 million to give you. Because if you knew my bank account balance, you would laugh and say, James, you can't give me that. That's not a temptation because you don't have $1 million to give me. Well, how could Lucifer be tempting Jesus with all the kingdoms of this world if they were not his to give? You say, James, you're twisting those words. Well, look at what Jesus said. If we go to John chapter 12, when Jesus is talking to the people, he says, now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. He's talking about Lucifer. Don't believe me? Let's go forward a couple of more chapters to John 14. Jesus is saying, I won't speak with you much longer. This is in the Last Supper. He says, for the ruler of this world is coming. He has no power over me. He's referring to Satan, to Lucifer. He goes on, Paul goes on. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, he says, among whom the God of this age has blinded the minds of those who do not believe, so they would not see the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God. Who's the God of this age? Well, according to Jesus, according to Paul, it's Lucifer. Paul echoes this in his letter to the Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 2, he says, in which you formerly lived according to this world's present path, according to the ruler of the domain of the air, the ruler of the spirit that is now energizing the sons of disobedience. And I'll just throw one more reference in for good measure. In 1 John chapter 19, John writes, we know that we are from God, and the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. You see, Adam and Eve lost their position of authority. They lost their ability to rule over the earth when they allowed Satan to trick them out of it. Satan wanted to be worshipped. He wanted to become a god. And he accomplished his purpose. That's why he rebelled and led Adam and Eve to rebel. That was the whole point. Yes, truth was at the heart of the matter. Yes, he wanted them to question if God was trustworthy. But at the heart of it all, for Lucifer, was to become like God, to be in a position of power, to control other people. And according to Jesus, during that time, Satan is the god of this world. Satan has taken humanity's birthright, and now he is the god of this world. Why would God allow that to happen? Well, as we go through the remaining rebellions, it'll make a lot more sense. But God has respected the law of liberty in human beings and in spiritual beings. He gave Lucifer the freedom to reject a relationship with him. He gave Adam and Eve the freedom to reject a relationship with him. And because both of them rebelled, Adam, Eve, and Lucifer, Adam and Eve lost their relationship with God. Lucifer lost his position in heaven. Lucifer took away the humanity's birthright and is now the god of this world. So, let's review pretty much what we just said. Rebellions corrupted God's original design. Lucifer desired to take God's place. Adam and Eve broke trust with God, and Satan became the ruler of this world. And in our next lesson, we will keep talking about there's 4 more rebellions for us to discuss. But this is the foundation. This sets the stage for all the other rebellions. It explains to us why the world is different from the original design God created when he made the heavens and the earth, his heavenly family and his earthly family. And we're going to learn how God's going to work through all of these rebellions and actually work through people and history to bring it all back to the way it was supposed to be again. If you have questions about this and you want to dig further into this, I encourage you keep watching these videos. But if you have questions about things the videos do not contain and you'd like more information or want to ask me something directly, please reach out. This is my contact information. So thank you so much for joining us for this lesson. I look forward to sharing more with you in the future. So until next time, be blessed.